So our next crusading professor is Irwin Cotler. Irwin Cotler, former Minister of Justice, recently former Minister of Justice, and I go way back. We're old pals. We go back to Montreal, back to Jewish parochial schools, back to McGill University and the debating union in McGill University. And I tell you all of this to impress upon you just how close he and I are. And so it came one day that I get a call from Irwin. We respect each other, we admire each other's careers. And he says to me, Moses, the party has decided it can only do one, same sex or marijuana. Without a moment's hesitation, I said marijuana. Irwin, come out here and tell us what you're working on now.
Great to see you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, to be part of IDEA, a city that is organized and inspired by my close friend Moses Namer, but to be part of a whole group here of idea makers, of innovators, of people who are really engaged in transformative work, like my colleague Alan Young. As I said to him before we began, I said I was going to speak about the wrongfully convicted. And then I heard that he was speaking about it. I said, you've got the best. And I just want to say that I found when I was Minister of Justice that one of the most important responsibilities I had was with respect to addressing and redressing issues of the wrongfully convicted. Just to give you one example, when I was a law student, I studied the case of Stephen Truscott, not as a case of wrongful conviction, but as a case of capital punishment. And fortunately, though he was sentenced to death, he did not hang. Some 45 years later, that case came before me as the Minister of Justice. And after a sustained involvement, I was able to determine that this was a case of a miscarriage of justice, of wrongful conviction. And you heard today from Alan the great cases and causes with which he is engaged, and which he invited all of us to be involved in common cause. And I would like in that regard to look at another dimension, really, of wrongfully convicted, about the defense of political prisoners internationally, and to share with you some of this common cause which undergirds really the struggle for human rights in respect of wrongfully convicted. And I see this case of wrongfully convicted, and really in the case of political prisoners internationally, we are talking about the struggle against hate, against atrocity, against impunity, against the criminalization of innocence, and really this as part of the larger struggle for human rights and human dignity and international justice in our time. It was my father who taught me when I was a young boy the profundity of a message that I did not fully understand at the time, but then began to appreciate more fully when he said to me that the pursuit of justice, as he put it, is equal to all the other commandments combined. This, as he put it, must always be your moral compass. This, as he put it, must be that which you should teach onto your children. But I have to say that it was my late mother, along with my late father, who, when she would hear my father's message to me, would say to me, you know, if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice is nothing other than a theoretical abstraction. And so I suspect that because of the teachings of my parents, that I got involved in two of the great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century. The struggle for human rights in the Soviet Union, and within that, the struggle for Soviet Jewry, and the struggle against apartheid. And got involved with two political prisoners who were the substance, the soul of these struggles. Nelson Mandela in South Africa, Anatoly Sharansky, as he then was, in the former Soviet Union. And I got to meet a great Soviet dissident, Andrei Sakharov, spoken of then as being the father of the human rights movement. Regrettably, not too many today may remember Andrei Sakharov, but his message is as compelling today as it was then, when in speaking of Sharansky, he said that the Soviet Union, in imprisoning Sharansky, sought to imprison human rights. That, as he put it with regard to Sharansky, that Sharansky is each and every one of us. Sharansky represents us all. And what was said of Sharansky could be said of Nelson Mandela or any of the political prisoners today. Each one of them represents each one of us. Each one of us represents us all in the struggle for human rights and human dignity. And Sakharov then taught another lesson, a lesson of how do you combat this criminalization of innocence. And he spoke about the importance of the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator, of putting the human rights violator in the docket, of standing in solidarity with the political prisoners, of letting them know that they are not alone, that we are with them in their struggle, that we are with them in their cause. And so it was that through Sakharov and others, I developed then, close to 40 years ago, an international advocacy model for political prisoners, which I'm going to share with you because it is a model which each one of us can find a way to be engaged in with respect to the cases of political prisoners in our time, whether we speak about political prisoners in Iran or in China or in Africa, wherever the question of the pursuit of justice is so compellingly engaged in the defense of political prisoners. The first thing, as Sakharov would say, is to expose and unmask the human rights violator. That is what the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator is all about. And one of the means of doing so is developing a legal brief to expose and unmask that human rights violator, because they are often preoccupied with their own legitimacy. And this is a way to expose and unmask them. And so I developed a legal brief with respect to Sharansky and other political prisoners at the time. But as it happened, one day before I was to appear in a Soviet court, I was arrested, detained, expelled, driven out to the tarmac, alighted onto a Japanese airliner, which fortunately was going to London and not to the Far East. But as I entered the plane, to the surprise of the Japanese attendants, they sort of looked at me and I said, "Look, I'm being expelled. I have two things to ask. Please get in touch with Dan Fisher, Moscow correspondent of Los Angeles Times. I'm supposed to have dinner with him this evening, just tell him I won't be there, and advise the Canadian Embassy of my expulsion." 4.5 hours later, I arrived in London, and I have to tell you, and I think the Soviets may have known this, that expulsion is a very disturbing phenomenon and feeling, because you worry about those you've left behind. You worry about what might happen to the political prisoners with whom you were involved. You worry about what might happen to the witnesses and all the documentation that they have taken from you and the like. And at that point, I phoned my wife. I had just been married 3 weeks. It was my children were about to say afterwards that since I got arrested and expelled in a number of different countries while they were growing up, they thought their daddy was really a criminal. As I called my wife and I said, "Don't tell anyone, I've just been expelled from the Soviet Union." And she answered me, "What do you mean, don't tell anyone? It's all over the news." Dan Fisher, Moscow correspondent of Los Angeles Times, broke this story. And because Sharansky was a celebrated international human rights hero at the time, I was able to get, as what Andy Warhol would say, my own 15 minutes of fame. But what it demonstrated was the importance of the media. A second lesson, the importance of the media in the unmasking and exposing of the human rights violator. The third was the importance of getting your own government involved. When I was expelled, the Canadian government then arranged for me to have a press conference in London. And on my return to Canada, Flora MacDonald, the then Foreign Minister of Canada, not only symbolically met me on arrival, but more importantly, suspended all bilateral Helsinki agreements with the Soviet Union because of this expulsion, but really validating, in effect, the case and cause of Anatoly Sharansky and those struggling for human rights in the Soviet Union. And a third fourth important dimension was the internationalization of advocacy, of not only a bilateral approach to the Soviet Union, but getting the international community involved in the exposing and unmasking of the human rights violations, as was done through the Helsinki Final Lock. And an important component here was the involvement both in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and for Mandela and Sharansky, of the families becoming involved. Avital Sharansky, Natan Sharansky's wife, became the face of and the messenger on his behalf while he was isolated in prison, just as Winnie Mandela became Nelson Mandela's face while he was in prison. And so you see the importance of families involved in the struggle. And then the other components of the mobilization of shame against the Soviet Union or South Africa, of the mobilization of human rights advocacy. These included the involvement of parliaments. The Canadian Parliamentary Group for Soviet Jewry was the largest of its kind in the world. The Canadian Parliamentary Committee for Anatoly Sharansky was the largest of its kind anywhere. And the importance of NGOs. The anti-apartheid movement was launched here in Canada through the NGOs like Amnesty International, the Canadian Labour Congress, and others who launched, and I was privileged to be with them at that time, when in the mid-'80s we launched the anti-apartheid struggle, spearheaded by the NGO movement. And the involvement of civil society in all respects. The involvement of women, of students, of academics, of scientists, of trade unions and the like, in a critical, massive advocacy, engaged with their counterparts in the Soviet Union, in South Africa, in the mobilization of shame, in the mobilization of human rights advocacy. A crucial component, and let me give you one case study, an example. I always wondered, how was it that Sharansky was released within the year that Gorbachev became president of the former Soviet Union? And I wondered, what role did Gorbachev have, if any, in that regard? It so happened that I was on a panel with Gorbachev some years later. He did not yet speak English, and so through an interpreter, I asked him the question about Sharansky and his role in Sharansky's release. And he said he was going to share a story with me, particularly as I was a Canadian. The import of all that I was saying really finds expression in this story. He said, "You may not believe it, but I had not heard of Anatoly Sharansky when I was in the Soviet Union. I was a minister of agriculture. I came to Canada on almost my first ever international trip. I came to appear before your Canadian Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture in Ottawa." He said, "I came before the committee, and apart from a few questions on agriculture, they all started to ask me about Sharansky. I didn't know who this Sharansky was. I then, when I exited the Parliament buildings, there was this big demonstration in Ottawa with regard to Sharansky, with regard to this struggle for human rights, as they put it, in the Soviet Union. I then met with your Minister of Agriculture, Eugene Whalen. Before he talked to me about agriculture, he talked to me about Sharansky. And so I came back to the Soviet Union. I then had become president of the Soviet Union. I ordered up the file. And, I looked at the file. Yes, he was a bit of a mischief maker, but he was not a criminal," he said. And here came the important words. He said, "But it was costing us. It was costing us politically, economically, legally, to imprison Sharansky. And so I ordered Sharansky's release." And what was true of what happened in the Soviet Union was also true with regard to South Africa. In South Africa, there was a very heroic anti-apartheid movement, as there was a heroic movement for human rights in the Soviet Union amongst the Helsinki Watch Group people and the like. And I was invited to speak in South Africa in 1981. By then, I was representing Sharansky for several years, and the topic given me by the people who invited me was, "If Sharansky, why not Mandela?" I said to the students who were part of those inviting me, Mandela's a banned person here in South Africa. The mere mention of his name can subject, and I said, "I'm a Canadian, nothing will happen to me, but could subject you to some criminal offense." And they said, "Don't worry about it. We want this story to be told." And so I gave the talk of, "If Sharansky, why not Mandela?" As soon as I concluded the talk, however, I found myself arrested and detained and then brought, surprisingly, to meet with the then Foreign Minister, Pik Botha of South Africa. And he ushered me into his office and he had a picture on the wall and he said, "Do you know who that is?" I said, "Yes, that's Anatoly Sharansky." And he said, "Right. And here how you see how the two cases converged. Soviet Union, South Africa, Sharansky, Mandela." He said, "I wanted to meet the person," he said, "who was defending a great hero of our time, Anatoly Sharansky, against the evil communist Soviet Union, and find out how in the same breath you could speak about Nelson Mandela, who is also a communist and also an enemy of ours." And I said, "You know, Sharansky and Mandela are fighting for the same thing. They're both fighting for freedom. They're both fighting for democracy. They're both fighting for human rights." I said, "Yes, the Soviet Union is a human rights violator. But South Africa," and I said, "You may not like this, Minister," I said, "but South Africa is the only post-World War II country that has institutionalized racism as a matter of law." I said, "Apartheid is not just a racist philosophy, it is a racist legal regime. And so for so long as it is necessary, from wherever I am, I will continue to fight against this racist legal regime." Fast forward, in 1990, Nelson Mandela, after 27 years in a South African prison, much of it in solitary confinement, was released and then presided not only over the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, but became the first president of a non-racial, egalitarian, democratic South Africa. And indeed, Mandela embodied the great struggles of the 20th century. The struggle for freedom, the struggle for equality, the struggle for democracy, the struggle for peace, the struggle for human rights. And all this came home to me in the significance of it when I went to, this past December, to Nelson Mandela's funeral. And I saw a young woman, about 17, with tears in her eyes. And I asked her, "What is it that Nelson Mandela means to you? What does he mean to South Africans?" And she said, "You know, Nelson Mandela means to me that I must live every day of my life in such a way as I can make it a better day for others." And then she said, "You know, I'm a young person." She said, "I wasn't alive even when Nelson Mandela was involved in his great struggle. I was born after he was released. But I promised myself that I must live every day in such a way that I live up to Nelson Mandela's legacy." And Nelson Mandela's legacy is also the importance of the defense of political prisoners. Think about it. If Nelson Mandela had not been freed after 27 years in that South African prison, we might not have seen the dawning of a democratic, non-racial, free South Africa. And what Mandela teaches us, and what Sharansky teaches, is the importance of these political prisoners who embody the great human rights struggles of which they are a part, and who, in their own expressions of moral courage, transformed human history. And so while my daughter told me after Sharansky and Mandela were released, she said, "Face it, Daddy, you have nothing else to do. Sharansky's been released. Mandela has been released. Apartheid is over. You have nothing else to do." I realize that the struggle for political prisoners remains the struggle for all of us. And so for the last 25 years, my involvement has been largely in terms of defending human rights in the Middle East, particularly through Sadat ad-Din Ibrahim, the great democracy freedom fighter in Egypt, who also was sentenced on false, trumped-up charges, and I was privileged to be engaged on his behalf. Or Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Laureate in China, and I'm now a part of his international legal team, but who symbolizes the struggle for freedom and hope in China, as Mandela did in the struggle for freedom and hope in South Africa. And all those brave people now in Iran, like Nasrin Sotoudeh, the iconic human rights lawyer who was in prison, and unfortunately, because of a critical mass of advocacy, we were able to secure her release, and we've launched in Parliament, in Canada and beyond, a global Iranian political prisoner advocacy project. And so, to close, These are the lessons that not only have I learned, but that I wanted to share with you, and I think are lessons for us in common cause. To speak on behalf of those who regrettably cannot be heard. To bear witness on behalf of those who are unable to testify. To act on behalf of those who are putting not only their livelihood, but putting their lives on the line. And at the end of the day, as Martin Luther King would tell us, the arc of history will bend towards justice. And like Sharansky and Mandela, if we work with the political prisoners of today, they will all be able to leave the shadows of darkness and enter the light of freedom. Thank you.
Well, with Erwin standing here and Alan seated there, I want, in your name, to thank these crusading professors with a bias to action. Thanks very much.
Thank you.